Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Sometimes, one simple choice ripples out in ways we never see coming. Clay Tabor was just a lonely old mountain man living up in Widow's Hollow, keeping to himself for 3 long winters. When a starving woman appeared at his door through the snow, he gave her his last piece of bread without thinking twice. She vanished into the wilderness, and Clay figured that was the end of it. A week later, he heard rumbling outside his cabin. Clay stepped onto his porch and couldn't believe what he saw. 200 people stood there, all armed, all looking right at him. They hadn't come to fight. They'd come because of what he'd done for that woman. What happened next would change Clay's life forever. But how does one loaf of bread bring 200 strangers to your door? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. Clay Tabor's hands were steady as he skinned the rabbit, the same hands that once held his father's worn leather journal filled with decades of mountain wisdom. The trapping guide had been passed down through 3 generations of Tabor men, each adding their own notes in faded ink about wind patterns, animal behavior, and the secrets of surviving where civilization feared to tread. Clay had memorized every page, but he still kept it close, wrapped in oiled cloth beside his bunk. The cabin sat like a weathered sentinel against the pine-covered slopes of Widow's Hollow, 3 miles up from where the last logging road surrendered to wilderness. Clay had built it with his own hands 7 years ago, using timber he'd felled himself and stones he'd hauled from the creek bed. Every board, every chink of mortar, every iron nail driven true, it was his fortress against a world that had taken too much from him. He'd come to this place carrying nothing but his father's journal, a Springfield rifle, and memories he'd rather forget. The war had ended for most folks, but it kept playing in Clay's head like a broken music box, the same terrible tune, repeating until he thought he might go mad from it. Up here, the only sounds were wind through timber and water over stone. Up here he could breathe. The morning routine never varied. Before dawn, Clay would check his trap lines, following paths he'd worn smooth through 3 winters of solitude. He knew every fallen log, every deer trail, every place where the creek ran shallow enough to cross without soaking his boots. By full light, he'd be back at the cabin, preparing whatever the mountain had provided, rabbit, squirrel, sometimes a grouse if he was lucky. He lived by the seasons as his grandfather had taught him. Spring meant fishing the swollen creek and gathering early greens. Summer brought berry picking and the hard work of cutting firewood for the months ahead. Fall was for hunting and smoking. Meat, building stores that would see him through the lean times. Winter meant hunkering down with his books and his thoughts, rationing supplies and waiting for the world to thaw. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles down the mountain, and Clay hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. The last time anyone had climbed up to Widow's Hollow was when Deputy Marshal Johnson made the trek to inform Clay that his brother Thomas had died in a railroad accident back in Kansas. Clay had thanked the man politely and offered him coffee, but he'd felt nothing. The war had burned that capacity right out of him. He'd learned to find peace in small things, the way morning mist rose from the creek, the perfect silence that came after fresh snowfall, the satisfaction of a clean shot when hunting, quick and merciful. These simple truths had replaced the complexity of human relationships, and Clay had convinced himself he was content with the trade. But contentment was a fragile thing, and it shattered. The evening that woman came walking out of the storm, Clay had been reading by lamplight, working his way through a book of Robert Burns' poetry he'd found in his father's things. The wind was howling something fierce, driving snow against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. He almost missed the sound of knocking over the storm's fury. When he opened the door, she stood there, like something conjured from the blizzard itself, thin as a rail, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone who couldn't have been more than 30. Her dress was patched in a dozen places, and he could see her ribs through the worn fabric. Snow clung to her dark hair like a widow's veil. "Please," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry to trouble you, mister, but I've been walking since yesterday and She swayed on her feet, and Clay caught her elbow before she could fall. He should have been suspicious. Nobody traveled these mountains alone, especially not in a storm that could kill a man in an hour. But looking at her face, Clay saw something that cut right through his careful isolation, desperation so pure it couldn't be faked. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "Get yourself by the fire." She moved like someone afraid the offer might be withdrawn, settling gingerly into the chair closest to the hearth. Clay poured hot coffee from the pot he kept warm on the stove and pressed the cup into her hands. She wrapped her fingers around it like it was salvation itself. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Her eyes filled with tears. "Day before yesterday. Maybe longer. I lose track." It was all he had until he could get down to Johnson's trading post next week, but the woman looked like she might blow away in the next gust of wind. He cut thick slices and spread them with preserves his neighbor's wife had traded for a rabbit skin. She ate like someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like, slow and reverent, tears streaming down her face with each bite. Clay busied himself banking the fire and checking the windows, giving her privacy for her hunger and her grief. "I can't pay you," she said when she'd finished. "I've got nothing left to give. Didn't ask for payment. You don't understand. I've got to get to Mercy Falls before—" Her voice broke. "My little girl, she's sick, and the doctor there, he might—" She covered her face with her hands. Clay knew better than to ask for details. People's sorrows were their own business. He made up a bed for her in the corner farthest from his own, using clean blankets he'd been saving. She protested weakly, but exhaustion won, and soon she was sleeping the deep sleep of someone who'd been running on empty for too long. In the morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, just boot prints in the snow leading east toward the lower valleys. Clay found himself staring at those tracks long, after they'd filled in with fresh snowfall. He told himself it was for the best. He'd done his Christian duty, fed someone in need, and now life could return to its proper order. But something had shifted in those few hours. The cabin felt different, somehow larger and emptier at the same time. He caught himself listening for sounds that never came, and setting out 2 cups before remembering he was alone. For a week, Clay tried to settle back into his routines. He checked his traps, chopped wood, read his books by the fire. But the woman's face kept returning to him, the desperate hope in her eyes when she'd mentioned the doctor in Mercy Falls, the way she'd cried over that simple meal. He found himself wondering if she'd made it, if her child was all right, if his small kindness had meant anything at all. The answer came on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after the storm. Clay woke to a sound he'd never heard before, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch, expecting to see a rock slide or maybe a herd of elk moving through the valley. What he saw instead defied all logic and reason. They stood in formation like an army, but not quite. Men, women, even children, all armed with rifles, shotguns, and hunting knives. Their clothes were patched and worn, their faces weathered by hard living, but their eyes burned with something Clay recognized from his war days, desperate determination. At the front of the group stood the woman from the storm, but she looked different now. Her hollow cheeks had filled out some, and she wore a clean dress that actually fit. Beside her stood a tall man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his coat, and a woman holding the hand of a small girl with fever-bright eyes. 200 souls, maybe more, all looking at Clay like he held the answer to something he didn't even understand. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the soft sobbing of someone in the crowd. Finally, the woman from the storm stepped forward. "Mr. Tabor," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong in the mountain air. "My name is Sarah Murphy. You saved my life. And through me, you've saved something else entirely. We've come to ask, no, to beg for your help." Clay's mouth went dry. He gripped the porch railing with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Sarah Murphy reached into her coat and pulled out a torn piece of paper, the edges brown with age and handling. Even from the porch, Clay could see the desperate scrawl of handwriting, words written in haste and fear. "This is my letter," she said, holding it up for him to see. "The one I was carrying when I came to your door. It's to my sister in Mercy Falls, telling her I was coming home to die with my daughter." Her voice caught. "I wrote, 'The children are starving, and no hope. Left because that's what I believed. That's what we all believed.'" The tall man with the sheriff's badge stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal grey hair and tired eyes. "Name's Frank Garrett, Mr. Tabor. I'm the sheriff of Mercy Falls, or what's left of it. Been wearing this badge for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened when Sarah came home." Clay's throat felt tight. What exactly did happen? Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I made it to town 2 days after the storm. Barely alive, but I made it. My little Emma," she gestured to the girl beside the woman in the crowd. She was burning with fever, hadn't opened her eyes in 3 days. Doc Henderson took one look at her and shook his head, said there wasn't anything he could do. "But then," Sheriff Garrett continued, "Sarah started telling everyone about you. About how a stranger up in the mountains had given her his last bread without asking for anything in return. About how you'd looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth saving." A woman in the crowd called out, her voice shaking with emotion. "My husband had been drinking again, Mr. Tabor, spending what little money we had on whiskey while our boy went hungry." But when Sarah told her story, something changed in Tom's eyes. He threw away that bottle and hasn't touched a drop since. Another voice joined in, an elderly man leaning heavily on a walking stick. "I'd given up, son. Lost my farm to debt collectors. Lost my wife to the fever. Was planning to walk into the woods and not come back. But Sarah's story made me remember what it felt like to believe in decency again." Clay gripped the porch railing harder, feeling the weight of all those eyes on him. "I don't understand. I gave a hungry woman some bread. That's what any decent person would do." "No, sir," Sarah said firmly. "That's what we thought too at first. But then we started talking to each other, really talking for the first time in years. And we realized something terrible." She looked back at the crowd, drawing strength from their presence. "We'd forgotten how to be kind to each other. We'd been so busy surviving, so afraid of losing what little we had, that we'd stopped seeing each other as human beings." Sheriff Garrett nodded grimly. "Mercy Falls is dying, Mr. Tabor. Has been for 5 years now, ever since the mine played out and the railroad moved their station 20 miles south. Folks started leaving, then the shops closed, then the bank. Those of us who stayed, we turned inward, every family for itself. The children were the worst off," added the woman holding Emma's hand. Sarah's sister, Clay realized. Going to bed hungry while neighbors hoarded food. Getting sick while we argued over who should pay for medicine. We were killing our own community with selfishness. Sarah stepped closer to the porch, her torn letter still clutched in her hand. "But your kindness, it was like striking flint to tinder. When I told them what you'd done, people started remembering what they'd forgotten. Mrs. Chen shared her last jar of preserves with the Williamson family. Old Pete fixed the Hendersons' roof without being asked. Children started playing together again instead of eyeing each other like competition. Within 3 days," Sheriff Garrett said, his voice filled with wonder, "we had more community than we'd seen in 5 years. People sharing food, sharing labor, sharing hope. Doc Henderson managed to save little Emma here using medicines that folks contributed from their own stores." The little girl stepped forward shyly, her fever-bright eyes now clear and curious. "Mister," she said in a small voice, "Mama says you're the reason I didn't go to sleep forever. Thank you." Clay felt something crack inside his chest. He'd spent 3 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that solitude was strength, that caring led only to loss. But looking down at this child alive, because his simple kindness had rippled outward in ways he never could have imagined, those walls began to crumble. That's wonderful," he managed. "I'm glad your town found its way back to itself, but I still don't understand why you're all here." The crowd shifted, and Clay caught sight of more faces. A young couple holding hands, their clothes patched but their expressions determined. A group of teenage boys who should have been surly and distant, but instead stood respectfully with their parents. An old woman who reminded him painfully of his own grandmother, her eyes bright with hope he hadn't seen in too many years. Sarah folded the torn letter carefully and tucked it back into her coat. "We're here because Mercy Falls is still dying, Mr. Tabor. Oh, we've found our hearts again, and that's a precious thing. But kindness doesn't fill empty bellies or fix broken roofs or bring back the jobs we lost. We need more than good intentions. We need a leader," Sheriff Garrett said bluntly. "Someone who understands survival, someone who can teach us to be self-sufficient, someone who's proven he puts others before himself." Clay shook his head, backing toward his cabin door. "I'm not a leader. I'm just a man who wants to be left alone." "Sir," called out a voice from the middle of the crowd, a man with work-calloused hands and desperate eyes. "I've got 5 children and no work. My oldest boy is talking about joining the railroad gangs down south, dangerous work that kills more men than it employs. My wife cries herself to sleep every night because she can't feed our baby properly." Another voice joined in. "My father's dying, Mr. Tabor. We can't afford to send him to the city for proper care, and Doc Henderson's doing what he can, but it's not enough. He needs medicine we can't buy, and treatment we can't provide. The bank's threatening to foreclose on what's left of our businesses," added a woman in a worn but clean dress. "We've got maybe 2 months before they take everything and force us to scatter to the winds." Sarah stepped onto the bottom step of Clay's porch. "We've tried everything else, Mr. Tabor. We've written letters to the territorial government, no response. We've pleaded with neighboring towns for help. They've got their own troubles. We've prayed and hoped and worked ourselves to exhaustion, but it's not enough." She pulled out a small cloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of the bread Clay had given her, hard as a rock now but carefully preserved. "This is all I have left of the meal that saved my life," she said. "I've carried it with me every day since, to remind me that miracles can come from the simplest kindness. But miracles aren't enough anymore. We need someone who can teach us to save ourselves." Clay looked out over the faces of 200 desperate souls, and for a moment he saw something else entirely. He saw his old unit, battered and exhausted, after 3 days of fighting, looking to him for orders that might keep them alive. He saw his father's customers, farmers and trappers who relied on Tabor wisdom to survive the harsh mountain winters. He saw his brother Thomas, young and trusting, asking Clay to teach him to shoot so he could provide for their family. All the people who had depended on him and all the ways he had failed them. "I can't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't be what you need." But even as he said the words, Clay knew he was lying. Not about his ability, he could see solutions to their problems already forming in his mind. He was lying about his choice. Because looking at little Emma's clear eyes and Sarah's carefully preserved bread and the desperate hope on 200 faces, Clay Tabor realized that sometimes a man doesn't get to choose his own path. Sometimes the path chooses him. The silence stretched between Clay and the crowd like a held breath. Finally, he stepped down. From his porch, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked toward Sarah Murphy. She held out the faded document she'd been clutching, not the torn letter this time, but something older. "This is Mercy Falls' original charter," she said, unfolding the yellowed paper with reverent care. "My grandfather was one of the founding members back in 1847. 23 families came together to build something lasting in that valley, something that could weather any storm." Clay studied the document, noting the careful handwriting and the signatures at the bottom, names like Murphy, Henderson, Chen, Garrett. What happened to that vision? Sheriff Garrett stepped forward, his weathered face grim. Same thing that happens to most dreams, I suppose. Time wore it down. The easy silver played out by 1890, and when the mine closed, folks started thinking more about their own survival than the community's. A man Clay didn't recognize spoke up from the crowd, tall and lean, with the calloused hands of someone who worked with tools. Name's Marcus Chen, Mr. Tabor. My great-grandfather signed that charter. He believed in something bigger than just getting by day to day. Clay looked around at the assembled faces, reading the mixture of hope and desperation in their eyes. And you think I can help you find that again? We know you can, Sarah said firmly. Not because you're some kind of miracle worker, but because you've already shown us what we'd forgotten, that caring for strangers is what makes us human. An elderly woman pushed forward, supported by a young man who looked like her grandson. Mr. Tabor, she said in a voice that carried the authority of years. I'm Martha Williamson. I've lived in Mercy Falls for 67 years, seen it rise and fall and rise again. What we need isn't charity or handouts. We need someone to teach us how to stand on our own feet. Clay folded the charter carefully and handed it back to Sarah. I'm listening. Sheriff Garrett pulled out a small notebook and flipped through pages covered with neat writing. We've inventoried what resources we have left. 43 families, ranging from newborns to folks in their 80s. Most of the men have some kind of trade skill: farming, carpentry, blacksmithing. The women know cooking, sewing, healing with herbs. What about land? Clay asked. Plenty of that, Marcus Chen replied. The mining company only took about a quarter of the valley for their operations. The rest is still there: good soil, fresh water, timber for building. Problem is, we never learned to use it right. A younger woman stepped forward, her face earnest. I'm Rebecca Garrett, the sheriff's daughter. I've been keeping the school going for the children who are left, but we need more than book learning. These kids need to see a future worth staying for. Clay studied the faces around him, his military mind automatically cataloguing strengths and weaknesses. These weren't broken people. They were people who'd forgotten their own strength. The difference was crucial. The railroad, he said. How far is the nearest station? 23 miles southeast, Sheriff Garrett replied. Takes a day's hard ride, 2 days with a wagon. So you're not completely cut off from outside markets. Clay's mind was already working through possibilities. What about the old mine infrastructure? Marcus Chen's eyes lit up. Most of it's still intact. The company left behind some equipment they considered too expensive to haul out. There's a good water wheel down by the creek, and the forge is still functional. Sarah Murphy stepped closer, her voice urgent. Mr. Tabor, I know it's a lot to ask. You came up to these mountains to be alone, and here we are, 200 people, asking you to take responsibility for our lives. But we're not asking you to save us, we're asking you to teach us to save ourselves. Clay looked at the charter again, thinking about the men who'd signed it. They'd been pioneers, people who'd looked at an empty valley and seen possibility instead of obstacles. What would you need from me? Exactly. Knowledge, said the man who'd spoken about his 5 children. How to make the most of what we have, how to organize work so everyone contributes and everyone benefits, how to plan for lean times instead of just hoping they won't come. Old Martha Williamson nodded vigorously. In the old days, we knew how to work together. Barn raisings, harvest crews, quilting circles, we took care of each other. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We lost our identity, Rebecca Garrett added. When the mine closed, it felt like the town's reason for existing died with it. But that charter, it wasn't about mining. It was about people choosing to build something together. Clay felt the weight of all those eyes on him. The hope and desperation mixed together in a way that reminded him painfully of war councils, where men's lives hung on the decisions he made. The difference was that this time the stakes weren't about winning or losing a battle. They were about whether a community would live or die. "I'm not a saint," he said finally. "I came up here because I was tired of people depending on me, tired of making decisions that affected other folks' lives." "What makes you think I won't let you down the way I've let down others?" Sarah Murphy's voice was steady as granite. "Because you gave me your last bread without knowing who I was or what I could give you in return. Because when you had every reason to turn me away, you chose kindness instead. That's not the action of a man who lets people down. That's the action of a man who puts others before himself." The crowd murmured agreement, and Clay saw heads nodding throughout the group. He realized they weren't seeing him as he saw himself as a man running from responsibility and failure. They were seeing him as he used to be, before the war and the losses had convinced him that caring was a luxury he couldn't afford. Sheriff Garrett stepped forward, his badge catching the morning light. "We're not asking for a permanent commitment, Mr. Tabor. Just come down to Mercy Falls with us. Look at what we're dealing with, meet the families, see if there's anything you can teach us. A week, maybe 2. If you decide we're beyond help, you can come back to your mountain with our blessing." Clay looked up at his cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney and the peace he'd found in solitude. Then he looked at little Emma, healthy now because his kindness had inspired her community to care for her properly. At Sarah Murphy, strong again because people had remembered how to help each other. At 200 faces that had journeyed up a mountain because they believed in the power of human decency. "1 week," he said, and felt something shift in his chest like a door opening after being barred for too long. "I'll give you 1 week and we'll see what's possible." The cheer that rose from the crowd echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder, and Clay Tabor realized that his long exile from the world of men was about to end. The journey down from Widow's Hollow took the better part of a day, winding through forest paths that Clay knew like the lines on his palm. He rode ahead of the main group with Sheriff Garrett, Sarah Murphy, and a handful of others, the weight of his father's military dog tags pressing against his chest from where he'd hidden them in a wooden box under his cabin floor that morning. He hadn't looked at those tags in 3 years, hadn't wanted to remember Captain Clayton Tabor of the 5th Colorado Infantry. But something about the way the townspeople had looked at him with the same trust his soldiers once showed had compelled him to retrieve them, not to wear, but to carry. A reminder of what leadership had cost him before. As they descended into the valley, Clay's trained eye automatically catalogued defensive positions, water sources, and natural choke points. Old habits from a different lifetime, but he couldn't shake them. The valley was well protected by ridges on 3 sides, with only one main approach from the southeast, where the old road came in, good for defense, bad for escape. His soldiers would have called it a death trap. "There she is," Sheriff Garrett said as they crested the final ridge. Mercy Falls, the town spread below them like a handful of scattered coins, maybe 60 buildings in various states of repair. Clay could see the logic of the original layout, Main Street following the creek, residential areas spreading up the hillsides, the massive scar of the old mine operation at the valley's eastern end. It had been planned by people who understood how communities grew. But growth wasn't the problem now. The problem was decay. Empty houses stood with broken windows and sagging porches. The main street was rutted with potholes that no one had bothered to fill. Weeds grew through the boardwalks, and several storefronts displayed hastily painted "closed" signs that looked months old. The only signs of life were thin streams of smoke rising from perhaps 20 chimneys scattered throughout the town. "How many people are left?" Clay asked. 147 souls as of last count," Sarah replied. "Down from over 600 at the mine's peak." As they rode down the main street, Clay began to see the human cost of the town's decline. Children peered at them from doorways with the hollow-eyed look of those who'd learned not to expect much from life. A group of men sat on the steps of what had once been the general store, their posture speaking of idleness, born from desperation rather than choice. But Clay also saw signs of the recent change Sarah had described. A woman was hanging freshly washed clothes on a line, and she waved cheerfully at the approaching group. Two teenage boys were working together to repair a fence, their laughter carrying on the autumn air. An elderly man was tending a small garden plot with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of every potato. They stopped in front of a two-story building that still bore the faded sign, Murphy's Boarding House. Sarah dismounted and turned to Clay with visible pride. "This was my grandmother's place," she said. "I've been trying to keep it running, but with so few travelers." She shrugged. "Still, it's warm, and the roof doesn't leak much." Clay studied the building with a practiced eye. Good bones, solid construction, but in need of basic maintenance. Like everything else in Mercy Falls, it was dying from neglect rather than any fundamental flaw. Over the next several hours, the townspeople gave Clay a thorough tour of their domain. He saw the abandoned school building where Rebecca Garrett now taught 15 children in a single room. He visited the church where Reverend Walsh still held services for a congregation that had dwindled from over 200 to barely 30. He examined the old mine workings, noting the potential for using the existing infrastructure for other purposes. But it was the people who captured Clay's attention most. Each family had a story that followed the same basic pattern: prosperity during the mining years, gradual decline as the ore played out, and then desperate attempts to survive as the town's economy collapsed. Yet, underneath the hardship, he sensed something that the war had taught him to recognize: resilience. Marcus Chen showed him the abandoned blacksmith shop where his father had once shod horses for the entire valley. "I've got some of his tools still," Marcus said. "But there's no call for horseshoes anymore, and I never learned to make anything else." "What about farming tools?" Clay asked. "Nails? Hinges for doors and shutters?" Marcus's eyes lit up. I never thought about that. I suppose I could learn." At the old general store, they met Tom Bradley, the man whose wife had mentioned his drinking problem. Clay found him sober, clear-eyed, and surprisingly knowledgeable about business. "I ran this place for 12 years before I started before I lost my way," Tom said. "Always figured there was no point in selling goods to folks who couldn't afford to buy them." "What if the goods were things they needed instead of things they wanted?" Clay suggested. "What if the store became a place where people traded services instead of just cash?" Old Martha Williamson approached them as they examined the abandoned schoolhouse. "Mr. Tabor," she said, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about teaching us to stand on our own feet. I used to run a weaving circle with the other ladies, made quilts and clothes for the whole community. Stopped when folks started leaving, but I still remember how." "The children need something to hope for," Rebecca Garrett added. "They need to see that staying in Mercy Falls doesn't mean accepting failure." As the afternoon wore on, Clay began to see patterns that his military training had taught him to recognize. These people weren't defeated, they were disorganized. They had skills, resources, and determination, but they'd lost the ability to coordinate their efforts effectively. The problem wasn't that Mercy Falls was dying. The problem was that it was dying inefficiently. That evening, the entire community gathered in the church for what Reverend Walsh called a town meeting, though it felt more like a war council to Clay. He stood at the front of the room, looking out at faces that ranged from hopeful to skeptical to desperate. "I've spent the day learning about your town," he began, "and I want to be clear about something from the start. I can't save Mercy Falls. Only you can do that." Murmurs of disappointment rippled through the crowd, but Clay held up his hand. "What I can do is help you see what you already have. You've got skilled craftsmen without work, farmable land that's not being used, and a community that's forgotten how to function as a team. Those are solvable problems." Sarah Murphy leaned forward in her seat. "What are you thinking?" Clay pulled out a piece of paper where he'd been sketching ideas throughout the day. I'm thinking that Mercy Falls doesn't need to go back to what it was. It needs to become something new, something sustainable that doesn't depend on outside forces you can't control. He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. But that's going to require every person in this room to work harder than they've ever worked before, trust each other more than they've ever trusted, and believe in something bigger than their own individual survival. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and doubt, in equal measure. Finally, Marcus Chen stood up. What do you need us to do? Clay spread the hand-drawn maps across the table in Murphy's boarding house, weighing down the corners. With coffee cups and candlesticks. The community garden plan had taken him most of the night to sketch, but seeing it laid out in careful detail made the impossible seem achievable. The key is thinking beyond this year, he explained to the group of families gathered around the table. A garden that feeds you for one season is charity. A garden that feeds you for 10 seasons is independence. Sarah Murphy traced her finger along the lines he'd drawn, showing crop rotation patterns. You're talking about more land than we've ever tried to farm. Because you've been thinking like individuals instead of a community, Clay replied. Marcus, how much time do you spend each day keeping your family's quarter-acre plot productive? The blacksmith looked thoughtful. 3, maybe 4 hours when things are growing well. And Tom, what about yours? About the same, Tom Bradley admitted. Clay tapped the largest section of his plan. If we pool your individual plots and work them together, you can probably manage 3 times the acreage with the same labor hours. Better soil preparation, shared tools, coordinated planting and harvesting. Rebecca Garrett studied the education section of his plan, where he'd marked areas for teaching children practical farming skills alongside their regular lessons. You want the school to be part of this? I want everything to be part of everything else, Clay said. That's how communities survive, when every part supports every other part. Old Martha Williamson hobbled closer, squinting at the detailed notes he'd written in the margins. What's this about crop storage and preservation? Root cellars, smoking houses, grain silos, Clay explained. Right now, you eat what you grow during the season and hope to buy the rest. We're going to build infrastructure so you can store food for lean times. A young farmer named Pete Henderson raised his hand tentatively. Mr. Tabor, this all sounds wonderful, but we've got maybe 6 weeks before hard frost. Even if we started today, we're not starting today, Clay interrupted. We started yesterday. Tom, did you talk to the Williams family about sharing their root vegetables? Tom nodded, grinning. They've agreed to contribute their entire potato crop to the community stores in exchange for help with their roof repairs. Marcus, what about those tools we discussed? The blacksmith held up his hands, still black with soot from the morning's work. Already started on a set of community farming implements. Should have them ready by week's end. Clay saw understanding dawn on several faces as his strategy became clear. He wasn't asking them to make dramatic changes. He was showing them how to coordinate the changes they were already making. Martha, tell them about the preservation project. The elderly woman straightened with visible pride. Me and 5 other ladies have been working on expanding our food preservation knowledge, not just what our mothers taught us, but techniques for large-scale operations. Clay brought us some books from his cabin about methods they use in farm communities back east. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. This could actually work. It will work, Clay said firmly, but only if everyone commits completely. No holding back resources for individual advantage. No deciding that your family's immediate needs matter more than the community's long-term survival. Sheriff Garrett, who'd been quietly listening from the back of the room, stepped forward. What about security? If we're successful, word's going to spread, might attract the wrong kind of attention. Clay had been expecting this question. His military background made him acutely aware of how prosperity could make a community a target. We'll address that when we need to. Right now, our biggest enemy isn't outside threats, it's internal discord. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted outside. Raised voices, the sound of a scuffle. And then Tom Bradley burst through the boarding house door with blood on his lip and anger in his eyes. "It's the Hutchins family," he said, breathing hard. "They're refusing to participate in the community stores. Say they don't trust the rest of us not to take more than our share." Clay felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten when soldiers in his unit started questioning orders during difficult campaigns. He'd seen how quickly mistrust could spread through a group under pressure. "Where are they now?" he asked. "Barricaded in their house," Sheriff Garrett replied grimly. "Jim Hutchins has his rifle out, says anyone who comes on his property is trespassing." Clay looked around the room at the faces of people who'd been filled with hope just minutes before. Already, he could see doubt creeping in. If the Hutchins family could refuse to participate, why shouldn't others? Why should anyone trust their neighbors when times got tough? "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Pete Henderson muttered. "Soon as things get difficult, folks start thinking only about themselves." "No," Clay said firmly. "This is exactly what we expected." He rolled up his garden plans and headed for the door. "Sarah, bring that charter your grandfather signed. The rest of you, come along if you want to see how communities really get built." The walk to the Hutchins property took 10 minutes, long enough for word to spread throughout Mercy Falls. By the time they arrived at the modest farmhouse on the edge of town, half the community had gathered in the yard. Clay could feel the tension crackling between the two groups, those who supported the community plan and those who sympathized with the Hutchins family's suspicion. Jim Hutchins stood on his porch with a rifle across his arms, his wife and 2 teenage sons flanked behind him. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the hard eyes of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "I've got nothing against you personally, Tabor," Hutchins called out. "But I've heard grand speeches before. When the mine closed, the company made all kinds of promises about taking care of folks. When the territorial government sent their representative, he promised state aid that never came. I'm not putting my family's survival in the hands of another stranger with big ideas." Clay stepped forward slowly, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. "You're absolutely right to be suspicious, Jim. If I were in your position, I'd feel the same way." The unexpected agreement seemed to catch Hutchins off guard. "Then you understand why we're staying out of this?" "I understand why you want to," Clay replied, "but I don't think you can afford to." He gestured to the assembled crowd. "Look around you, Jim. These aren't strangers making promises. These are your neighbors making commitments. Sarah Murphy there, she vouched for you when you needed credit at the store during the bad winter 3 years ago. Marcus Chen's father shod your horses for 15 years and never once overcharged you. These people have already proven they'll help you when times get tough." Jim's grip on his rifle tightened. "And when times get really tough? When there's not enough food to go around, or when outside troubles come calling, you think they'll risk their own families for mine?" Clay felt the weight of his hidden dog tags against his chest, remembering another time when frightened men had needed to trust each other to survive. "I think they'll do what people do when they've got something worth protecting. They'll fight for it together." He pulled out Sarah's charter and held it up so everyone could see. "Your grandfather signed this document, Jim. Right there, Joseph Hutchins, one of the original founders of Mercy Falls. He believed in something bigger than individual survival." "My grandfather was a fool," Jim said harshly. "Trusted the wrong people and lost everything." "Your grandfather was a pioneer," Clay replied. "And pioneers always take risks that seem foolish to people who've forgotten how to hope." The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the whisper of wind through the valley and the distant sound of water flowing over stones. The old mining equipment sat like the bones of a dead giant in the eastern section of the valley, rusted and abandoned but still carrying the promise of resurrection. Clay ran his hands along the massive gear assembly of the main hoist, feeling the solid construction beneath years of neglect. With the right restoration, this machinery could power more than just mineral extraction. Most folks figured this was all worthless when the company pulled out, Marcus Chen said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. But you're seeing something different, aren't you? Clay nodded, his engineer's eye cataloging possibilities. Water power from the creek, gear ratios that could run sawmills, grain mills, even textile equipment. Your ancestors built this to last, and it's barely scratched the surface of what it could do. Over the past week, the community had rallied around his restoration project with an enthusiasm that surprised even Clay. The confrontation with Jim Hutchins had ended better than expected, not with full conversion, but with grudging agreement to observe and evaluate. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for from suspicious men. Sarah Murphy climbed down from the platform where she'd been examining the hoist controls. Rebecca thinks she could use the smaller building there for expanded school programs. Hands-on learning about mechanics and engineering. Good thinking, Clay replied. Children should understand how things work, not just accept them as mysteries. But even as he spoke, Clay felt the familiar weight of his hidden past pressing against his chest. The community was beginning to depend on him in ways that brought back memories he'd tried to bury. Late at night, lying in Sarah's boarding house, he'd catch himself listening for the sound of approaching riders, planning defensive positions, calculating how many armed men it would take to overrun the valley. Old habits from a different lifetime, but he couldn't shake them. Clay, Sarah called from across the work area. There's something we need to discuss. He followed her to a quiet spot beside the creek, away from the sound of hammering and the chatter of workers. Her expression was serious, almost worried. People are talking, she said without preamble. Good talk. Mostly about how you seem to know exactly what needs doing, how you can look at a problem and see solutions nobody else thought of. But there are questions too. Clay felt his stomach tighten. What kind of questions? About where you learned to organize people so effectively, about why you understand defensive positions and supply logistics better than most sheriffs, about the way you automatically take command in crisis situations. Sarah studied his face carefully. Frank Garrett thinks you have military experience, extensive military experience. The truth sat between them like a loaded gun. Clay could deflect, change the subject, or tell her just enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing the whole story. But looking at Sarah's honest face, he realized he was tired of carrying the weight alone. I was an officer in the 5th Colorado Infantry during the war, he said quietly. Captain Clayton Tabor, if you want the formal title. Led men in some battles you probably heard about, and quite a few you didn't. Sarah nodded slowly. That explains a lot, but it doesn't explain why you're up in Widow's Hollow living like a hermit instead of using those skills where they're needed. Clay picked up a handful of pebbles and began throwing them into the creek, watching the ripples spread outward. Because the last time I used those skills, good men died because of decisions I made. Because I learned that when people depend on you, you can let them down in ways that matter more than life or death. What happened? The question hung in the air between them, and Clay found himself remembering things he'd sworn never to think about again. There was a place called Honey Springs, Confederate position we were ordered to take. I had intelligence that suggested a frontal assault would fail, but my commanding officer insisted on the plan. He threw another pebble, harder this time. I could have refused the order, could have demanded a court-martial, rather than lead my men into what I knew was a trap, but I was young and thought I was clever. Thought I could modify the plan just enough to keep my boys safe while still following orders. Sarah waited patiently as Clay struggled with memories that still felt like open wounds. 23 men went up that hill with me, he continued. 11 came back down. And the worst part, the part that made me run to the mountains and swear never to lead anyone again, was that the modified plan worked. We took the position. The brass called it a brilliant tactical victory. But you lost 12 men. I lost 12 men because I compromised between doing what I thought was right and doing what I was told. If I'd followed orders exactly, we probably would have lost more. If I'd refused the orders completely, maybe we could have found a different way. But I tried to split the difference, and 12 families got letters telling them their sons and husbands died for a brilliant tactical victory. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the restored mining equipment where the people of Mercy Falls were building something new from the bones of something old. "Those men who died," she said finally, "do you think they would want their sacrifice to mean that you never help anyone again?" Clay felt anger flare up, the same anger that had driven him into isolation. "That's not fair. Neither is abandoning 200 people because you're afraid of making mistakes." Sarah's voice was gentle but uncompromising. "Clay, I've watched you work this week. You don't make reckless decisions. You listen to people, you plan carefully, and you put the community's needs ahead of your own comfort. That's not the behavior of someone who compromises when lives are at stake. You don't understand. I understand that you gave me your last bread without thinking twice about your own survival. I understand that you've spent a week teaching us to be self-sufficient instead of dependent. And I understand that whatever happened at Honey Springs, it made you a better leader, not a worse one." Clay wanted to argue, to explain why she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself thinking about little Emma, healthy now because his kindness had inspired a community to care for her, about Marcus Chen's enthusiasm for the restoration project, about the hope he'd seen growing in faces that had forgotten what hope looked like. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Frank Garrett got a letter yesterday from the Territorial Marshal's office. They're asking questions about a man matching your description, someone who might be in this area." Clay felt the world shift beneath his feet. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest your past might be catching up with you, whether you want it to or not." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "The question is, are you going to run again, or are you going to trust this community to stand with you the way you've been standing with us?" Before Clay could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley, riders approaching fast from the southeast. Sheriff Garrett appeared from behind the mining equipment, his hand resting on his revolver. 12 men, he called out, armed and riding hard. "They'll be here in 10 minutes. Clay felt the familiar surge of tactical awareness that had kept him alive through 3 years of war. But this time, instead of calculating retreat routes, he found himself thinking about defensive positions and how to protect the people who'd trusted him with their lives. "Sarah," he said, "gather everyone at the church, children and elderly in the back rooms, able-bodied adults ready to defend if necessary. What about you?" Clay looked at the approaching dust cloud, then at the faces of the people around him, people who'd become more than just a responsibility. They'd become something he'd thought he'd lost forever. "I'm staying," he said. "We'll face this together." The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust and leather, their horses lathered from hard travel. Clay positioned himself in front of the church where the townspeople had gathered, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. But as the dust settled and he got a clear look at the lead rider, his blood turned to ice. The man dismounting from the black stallion was someone Clay had hoped never to see again. Colonel James Morrison, his former commanding officer. Older now, with silver threading through his dark beard, but unmistakably the same man who'd ordered the assault on Honey Springs 7 years ago. Behind Morrison rode 11 soldiers in civilian clothes, but Clay's trained eye caught the military bearing, the identical saddles, the way they positioned themselves in a protective formation. This wasn't a chance encounter. Morrison removed his hat and walked forward with the measured pace of a man accustomed to having others wait for his convenience. "Captain Tabor," he said, his voice carrying the same tone of casual authority that had haunted Clay's nightmares. "Or should I say, the famous Clayton Tabor, the ghost of Glorietta Pass." A murmur ran through the crowd behind Clay. He heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, saw Sheriff Garrett's hand move toward his weapon. But it was the look of recognition, and something close to awe on Marcus Chen's face that told Clay his secret was about to become very public knowledge. "It's just Clay now, Colonel," he replied evenly. "I left the war behind a long time ago." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Did you? Because from what I hear, you've been doing a remarkable job of organizing this little community. Teaching them tactics, planning defenses, turning them into quite the efficient operation." He gestured at the restored mining equipment and the obvious signs of coordinated work throughout the valley. "Looks very much like the work of the most brilliant tactical mind I ever had the privilege to command." From the crowd, old Martha Williamson's voice rang out clear and strong. "Mister, I don't know who you think you're talking to, but Clay Tabor is the man who saved this town. He's no ghost. He's the most decent human being any of us have ever known." Morrison's smile widened. "Oh, Mrs. Williamson, and you're on our land without invitation. Mrs. Williamson, I think there are some things about your decent human being that you might find interesting." Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a yellowed wanted poster, unfolding it with theatrical precision. Clay's stomach dropped as he saw his own face staring back at him, younger, harder, with the cold eyes of a man who'd seen too much killing. But it wasn't a wanted poster in the traditional sense. Across the top, in official military typography, were the words, "Reward for information, leading to the whereabouts of Captain Clayton Tabor, Medal of Honor recipient, presumed dead in action." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah Murphy pushed through the crowd until she stood beside Clay. "What is this supposed to mean?" Morrison's voice took on the tone of a man delivering a prepared speech. "It means, Miss Murphy, that your Clay Tabor is actually one of the most decorated war heroes in United States military history. The ghost of Glorieta Pass, the man who held a Confederate regiment for 3 days with 40 men and a broken artillery piece. The officer who saved 600 civilians at Wagon Mound by orchestrating the most brilliant tactical retreat in the annals of frontier warfare." Clay felt the world spinning around him. "Morrison, what are you doing?" "I'm recruiting you, Captain." Morrison folded the poster carefully and tucked it back into his coat. "The United States Army has a problem that requires your particular expertise. I told you I'm done with the war." "The war's done, Captain." "This is something new." Morrison gestured to his men, and one of them brought forward a leather satchel. "We've got Apache war parties cutting a bloody swath through New Mexico territory. 3 settlements wiped out in the past 2 months, 2 cavalry patrols destroyed, and every conventional military response has failed." Clay shook his head firmly. "Find someone else." "There is no one else with your record against irregular forces. And frankly, after what happened to the Patterson family last week, women and children, Captain, we're running out of time to be selective." The words hit Clay like a physical blow. Images of Honey Springs flashed through his mind, the screaming, the blood, the look in his sergeant's eyes as he died because Clay had tried to thread the needle between duty and conscience. "I won't do it," he said. Morrison nodded as if he'd expected this response. "I thought you might feel that way, which is why I brought along some additional incentive." He gestured again, and another rider dismounted. This man was different, not military, but wearing the badge of a federal marshal. Clay recognized the type. A government man with the power to make problems disappear or create new ones as circumstances required. "Marshal David Crenshaw," Morrison said by way of introduction. "Marshal Crenshaw has been investigating some irregularities in the territorial land grants for this valley. Seems there might be some question about whether Mercy Falls actually has legal title to the property they've been living on." Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "What are you talking about?" "We've got the original charter, which was filed with the territorial government in 1847, Marshal Crenshaw interrupted smoothly. "Unfortunately, there was a clerical error in the original filing. The boundaries were never properly surveyed, and according to our current records, This entire valley reverts to federal ownership if the original settlers can't prove continuous beneficial use. Clay felt rage building in his chest, the same cold fury that had carried him through the worst battles of the war. And I suppose this beneficial use can only be proven through some bureaucratic process that would take years and cost more money than these people have. Exactly, Morrison said. Unless, of course, they happen to have a federally recognized war hero willing to vouch for their community's strategic value to territorial defense. Someone with the authority to declare this a vital frontier settlement under military protection. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Clay could walk away and let Morrison destroy everything these people had built, or he could accept a commission that would inevitably lead to more death, more impossible choices, more nights lying awake, wondering if the men who died because of his orders had families who still wondered why they'd never come home. "You bastard," he said quietly. "I prefer to think of myself as pragmatic," Morrison replied. "Captain Tabor, you've got exactly 10 minutes to decide. Accept a field commission as Special Operations Commander for Apache Territory, or watch Marshal Crenshaw serve eviction notices to 200 people who've already lost everything once." Clay looked back at the faces of the people who'd trusted him. He saw fear there now, but also something else, determination. These weren't the broken refugees who'd climbed up to his cabin 2 weeks ago. These were people who'd remembered how to fight for what mattered. Sarah Murphy stepped up beside him, her hand finding his arm. "Clay," she said softly, "we knew this might come. We talked about it, remember? About trusting each other." Marcus Chen pushed through the crowd, his blacksmith's hammer still in his hand. "Mr. Tabor, Captain Tabor, whatever they're asking you to do, you don't have to face it alone." More voices joined in, Sheriff Garrett declaring that any federal marshal would have to go through him first. Rebecca Garrett saying the children needed their teacher and protector. Old Martha Williamson announcing that she'd lived through territorial bureaucrats before and wasn't impressed. Even Jim Hutchins, suspicious Jim Hutchins, who'd barricaded himself in his house rather than trust the community plan, stepped forward with his rifle across his arms. "Don't know much about military matters," he said, "but I know when a man's being railroaded. You helped us find our backbone, Tabor. Time we returned the favor." Clay felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen since Honey Springs. These people weren't his soldiers to command, they were his community to protect. And maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. He turned back to Morrison with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Colonel," he said, "I think you misunderstood something fundamental about the situation here." "Did I?" "Yes. You seem to think I'm the same man who took orders from you 7 years ago." Clay stepped forward, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I'm not. And these people aren't helpless settlers you can intimidate with bureaucratic threats." Morrison's confident smile began to fade. "Captain, I wouldn't advise—" "It's not Captain anymore," Clay interrupted. "And Marshal Crenshaw, if you want to try. Serving eviction notices to armed citizens on land. They've improved and defended. You're welcome to attempt it. But I should mention that this community now falls under the protection of a man you've just identified as the ghost of Glorieta Pass." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and threat in equal measure. "So here's my counteroffer, Morrison. You and your men mount up and ride out of this valley. You forget you ever found me, and I'll forget you ever threatened my people. Because if you don't—" Clay's hand moved to rest on his sidearm, a gesture that was casual but unmistakable. "Well, there's a reason they call me a ghost." The tension stretched like a taut wire between Clay and Colonel Morrison, but it was broken by an unexpected sound, the slow, measured clapping of hands. Jim Hutchins stepped forward, his weathered face split by a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, still clapping. "The ghost of Glorieta Pass. No wonder you knew exactly how to organize a defense when those bandits hit the Johnson place last month." Morrison's carefully controlled expression flickered with confusion. What bandits? Clay felt Sarah's hand tighten on his arm as he realized their situation had just become significantly more complicated. Jim, but Hutchins was warming to his theme, apparently deciding that if secrets were being revealed, he might as well reveal them all. Road agents been hitting isolated homesteads all through the territory, Colonel. But they made the mistake of trying it here after Clay showed us how to set up proper watch rotations and signal systems. Sheriff Garrett stepped up beside Hutchins, his badge catching the afternoon light. What Mr. Hutchins is trying to say, Colonel, is that we've already been dealing with the kind of irregular warfare you mentioned. Successfully, I might add. Clay watched Morrison's face as understanding dawned. The Colonel's eyes sharpened with professional interest, and Clay knew they'd just walked into a trap within a trap. Interesting, Morrison said slowly. Marshal Crenshaw, perhaps we should reassess the situation here. The federal marshal consulted a leather portfolio he'd been carrying. According to territorial law, any community that can demonstrate active defense against hostile forces may qualify for provisional federal protection status, which would make the land grant question moot, Morrison added with satisfaction. Captain Tabor, it seems you've been conducting military operations, whether you admitted it or not. Clay felt the walls closing in. Every success, every improvement he'd helped bring to Mercy Falls was being twisted into evidence that he was already doing the job Morrison wanted him to do. Defending your home isn't military operations. It is when you're doing it with tactical precision against organized criminal forces. Morrison gestured to his men, and one of them brought forward another set of documents. We've been tracking the Carver gang for 8 months, Captain. 43 men led by a Confederate deserter named Black Jack Carver. They've been hitting settlements from here to the Colorado border. Sarah Murphy moved closer to Clay, her voice tight with worry. What does this have to do with us? Everything, I'm afraid. Morrison's voice carried a tone of false regret. You see, Carver's gang has been following a pattern. They hit isolated communities, test the defenses, retreat if they meet significant resistance. Then they regroup and come back with overwhelming force. Clay's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. You're saying our success has painted a target on Mercy Falls. I'm saying that by organizing this community into an effective defense force, you've guaranteed that Carver will eventually return with enough men to crush any resistance. Morrison spread his hands as if the conclusion was obvious. The only question is whether you'll face them with proper military support or watch them destroy everything you've built here. Marshal Crenshaw consulted his portfolio again. The territorial government is prepared to offer Mercy Falls full federal protection and confirmed land grants in exchange for Captain Tabor's services as Special Operations Commander. And if we refuse? Clay asked, though he already knew the answer. Then you'll face the Carver gang alone, Morrison said. 43 hardened killers against how many able-bodied defenders do you have? 20? 25? Clay looked around at the faces of his adopted community. He saw determination there, but also fear. These people had just learned that their newfound security had made them targets for something far worse than territorial bureaucrats. Rebecca Garrett stepped forward, her teacher's instincts making her think about the children first. How long do we have? Morrison checked a pocket watch with theatrical precision. Our scouts report Carver's gang massing at Devil's Canyon, about 30 miles southeast. They'll move at first light tomorrow. You have perhaps 18 hours to decide. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. Clay felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between duty and personal desire, between protecting the people he cared about and accepting a role that would inevitably lead to more death and moral compromise. But then, Sarah Murphy did something unexpected. She stepped away from Clay and faced the assembled community. Before anyone makes any decisions, she said clearly, I think we need to discuss this as a town. This is our home, our lives, our choice. "Ma'am," Morrison began, "with all due respect—" "With all due respect, Colonel," Sarah interrupted. "You're not citizens of Mercy Falls. Clay is. Whatever decision gets made here, it needs to be made by the people who live with the consequences." Clay watched with growing pride as his neighbors, no, his fellow citizens, formed a natural circle around him and Morrison's men. These weren't the desperate refugees who'd climbed up to Widow's Hollow begging for salvation. These were people who'd remembered how to make decisions together. Marcus Chen raised his hand. "I want to hear Clay's assessment, not the Colonel's threats or the Marshal's legal arguments. What does our resident military genius think we should do?" Clay looked around the circle of faces, seeing expectation and trust that both humbled and terrified him. These people weren't asking him to sacrifice himself for their safety. They were asking him to help them figure out how to survive together. "Tactically," he said slowly, "Morrison's right about the numbers. If Carver brings 40 men against our 25, we'll lose. But there are other factors to consider." He walked to the center of the circle, his mind automatically shifting into the planning mode that had kept his soldiers alive through impossible odds. "We know this terrain better than they do. We have prepared defensive positions. And most importantly, we're fighting for our homes while they're fighting for profit." Tom Bradley stepped forward. "What about the federal protection the Colonel's offering?" "It comes with strings attached," Clay replied. "If I accept Morrison's commission, I'll be required to leave Mercy Falls to fight Apache. The federal protection would mean soldiers stationed here, military law, and probably the end of the community we've built." Old Martha Williamson hobbled closer to the center of the circle. "Seems to me we've got three choices. Run, surrender our independence for government protection, or fight." "Those are the options," Clay agreed. Jim Hutchins spoke up from his position at the edge of the circle. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Tabor, about my grandfather being a pioneer instead of a fool. Pioneers don't run from trouble. They face it and figure out how to overcome it." "Are you saying you want to fight?" Sarah asked. "I'm saying I want to remain free," Hutchins replied. "And sometimes freedom requires fighting." Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat. "Before we make any decisions, I think we need to understand exactly what we'd be facing. Clay, what would it take to defend Mercy Falls successfully?" Clay closed his eyes for a moment, letting his tactical mind work through the problem. When he opened them again, he saw Morrison watching him with professional interest. "First, we'd need to improve our defensive positions significantly. The church and school buildings are stone construction. They could serve as strong points. We'd need to dig connecting trenches, set up overlapping fields of fire, and create fallback positions." He gestured toward the mining equipment. "Second, we'd use our advantages. The restored hoist machinery could be rigged as a weapon, drop mining equipment on attackers trying to come up the main approach. The creek gives us water, but more importantly, it gives us a natural obstacle that channels enemy movement." "What about ammunition and weapons?" Marcus asked. "We've got hunting rifles and shotguns, but we'd need more ammunition than any of us have on hand. And we'd need to coordinate our fire discipline, no wasted shots, overlapping coverage, designated marksmen for priority targets." Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying grudging respect. "That's a solid defensive plan, Captain. But it assumes Carver will obligingly attack your prepared positions instead of simply burning you out or laying siege." "Which is why we wouldn't fight defensively," Clay said with a slight smile. "We'd fight like ghosts." The reference to his wartime nickname sent a visible shiver through Morrison's men, but Clay was focused on his community now, sharing with them the hard-earned wisdom that had kept him alive through 3 years of impossible battles. "Carver's gang expects us to either run or hole up and wait for them to overwhelm us. They're not expecting coordinated guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and the kind of territorial knowledge that turns every tree and rock into a potential ambush point." Sarah stepped closer to Clay, her voice quiet but clear. "And you could teach us to fight that way?" "I could teach you to survive," Clay replied. "But there's something else you need to understand. If we choose to fight, some of us probably won't survive the fighting. Are you prepared for that possibility?" The circle fell silent as people contemplated the reality of what they were considering. Clay watched their faces, seeing fear and determination warring for dominance in each expression. Finally, it was little Emma Murphy who broke the silence. The child stepped out from behind her mother and looked up at Clay with the clarity that only children possess. "Mr. Clay," she said in her small, clear voice, "if we run away, will the bad men just follow us to wherever we go?" Clay knelt down so he could meet her eyes at her level. "They might, sweetheart. And if we let the soldiers protect us, will we still be able to make our own choices about how we live?" Clay glanced at Morrison before answering. "Probably not." Emma nodded with the solemn wisdom of a child who'd already seen too much hardship. "Then I think we should fight. This is our home." As if her words had broken a dam, voices began rising around the circle. Not arguments or debate, but statements of commitment and resolve. Clay listened to his neighbors, his friends, choosing courage over safety, independence over security, and he realized that whatever happened in the next 24 hours, Mercy Falls had already won the most important battle. They'd chosen to remain free. The town bell that had stood silent for 3 years began to ring at first light, its bronze voice echoing through the valley with a sound that spoke of defiance rather than defeat. Clay had insisted on restoring the old bell to working order as part of their defensive preparations, understanding that communication could mean the difference between victory and massacre. From his position on the ridge overlooking the main approach to Mercy Falls, Clay watched the dust cloud that marked the Carver gang's advance. 43 men, just as Morrison had said, riding in loose formation with the confidence of predators who'd never encountered serious resistance. "They're moving exactly like you predicted," Marcus Chen whispered from his concealment behind a fallen log. The blacksmith had proven surprisingly adept at fieldcraft, moving through the forest with the quiet patience of someone who understood that noise meant death. Clay studied the approaching riders through his field glasses, noting their weapons, their positioning, the way they rode. "See how spread out they are? They're not expecting trouble until they reach the town itself. That's our advantage." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of waiting in the town for a siege they couldn't win, Clay had positioned his defenders throughout the approaches to Mercy Falls. Small teams of 2 or 3 people, armed with the best rifles the community possessed, would hit the gang from multiple directions as they moved through the narrow valley. "Remember," Clay said quietly to Marcus and Tom Bradley, who comprised his first firing team, "we're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to make them think twice about the cost of victory." The town bell rang again, 2 long peals, followed by 3 short ones. Sarah Murphy's signal that the southern approach was clear and the gang was committed to the main route through the valley. Clay felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded combat, but this time it was different. At Honey Springs, he'd been fighting for abstractions, territorial integrity, military objectives, political goals that meant nothing to the men who bled and died for them. Here, he was fighting for people he'd shared meals with, children he'd taught to read, friends who'd trusted him with their lives, not because they had to, but because they chose to. "First shots go to Tom," he whispered. "Marcus, you take the second rider from the left. I'll handle the leader. Remember 1 shot, then move to secondary positions immediately." Through his glasses, Clay could see Blackjack Carver himself leading the group. A big man with a cavalry saber hanging from his saddle and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. But dangerous men often made the mistake of assuming their reputation was armor enough. "Range?" Marcus asked. 200 yards and closing." Clay settled his rifle against his shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of precision machinery designed for the single purpose of ending human life. "Tom, you ready?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Tom replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Clay watched Carver's gang ride into the killing zone, noting their casual alertness. They were professionals, but they were professionals who'd grown comfortable with weak opposition. That comfort was about to become their weakness. Fire! 3 rifle shots cracked almost simultaneously, their reports echoing off the valley walls like thunder. Clay's bullet took Carver in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Tom's shot dropped one of the lieutenant types from his horse, while Marcus's round sent another rider tumbling into the dust. The gang's reaction was immediate and predictable. They wheeled toward the source of the gunfire, spurring their horses up the slope in a charge meant to overwhelm the shooters with speed and fury. But by the time they reached the first position, Clay and his team were already moving to their secondary firing points 50 yards to the east. The town bell rang again, 4 short peals that meant the second phase of the plan was in motion. From concealed positions throughout the valley, more rifles began speaking. Not a concentrated volley that would reveal all their positions at once, but scattered, carefully timed shots that made the gang think they were surrounded by a much larger force. Sheriff Garrett's voice carried across the valley from his position near the creek. "You boys picked the wrong town to rob. Mercy Falls don't take kindly to visitors with bad intentions." That was Jim Hutchins, his voice full of the grim satisfaction of a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. Clay watched through his glasses as confusion began to spread through the gang's ranks. Instead of the handful of frightened settlers they'd expected, they were facing coordinated resistance from defenders who knew every tree, every rock, every fold in the ground that could conceal a rifle barrel. Carver himself had regained his feet and was trying to rally his men, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "It's a trick! There can't be more than 20 of them. Form up and charge the town." But fear was a contagious thing, and several of Carver's men were already looking toward the mouth of the valley as if calculating retreat routes. Clay smiled grimly. This was the crucial moment when the gang would either break and run or commit fully to overwhelming the town by sheer force of numbers. The town bell rang once more, one long, sustained toll that meant all positions prepare for final assault. Clay chambered another round and settled his rifle against his shoulder. "Here they come, boys. Make every shot count." Black Jack Carver's charge up the main street of Mercy Falls was met not with panicked flight, but with something he'd never encountered before: organized, disciplined resistance that turned every building into a fortress and every window into a gun port. Clay had positioned himself in the bell tower of the church, giving him a commanding view of the entire battlefield. Below him, he could see his plan unfolding with deadly precision. The gang had taken the bait, committing all their remaining forces to a frontal assault on what they thought was a defenseless town. They were wrong. Sarah Murphy's voice rang out clear and strong from the schoolhouse. "For Emma, for all our children." Her rifle spoke, and another rider tumbled from his horse. From the restored mining equipment, Marcus Chen triggered the mechanism they'd rigged the night before. The massive hoist suddenly released its load, a ton of iron ore that crashed down directly in front of the charging horses, creating an instant barrier that broke their formation and sent several animals rearing in terror. Clay smiled grimly as he took aim at a rider trying to flank around the obstacle. His shot was true, and the man pitched sideways from his saddle. But even as he chambered another round, Clay could see that the gang was adapting to their tactics. Carver was wounded but still in command, and he was directing his remaining men to dismount and advance on foot, using the buildings for cover. "Smart," Clay murmured to himself, "but not smart enough." He rang the bell, twice the signal for Phase 3. Throughout the town, defenders began falling back to predetermined secondary positions. To Carver's men, it would look like retreat. In reality, it was the beginning of the trap within the trap that Clay had spent the night preparing. Old Martha Williamson appeared in the window of her house, deliberately exposing herself as bait. "You boys looking for something?" she called out cheerfully, then ducked back inside, just as 3 rifles fired at her position. The gang members took the bait, rushing toward what they thought was an isolated target. But as they reached the front porch, Tom Bradley and two other defenders rose from concealed positions in Martha's garden, their shotguns speaking with devastating effect at close range. Similar scenes played out throughout Mercy Falls as Carver's gang found themselves drawn into a maze of crossfire and carefully planned ambushes. Every apparent weakness was a strength in disguise. Every retreat was actually an advance to a better position. Clay continued to coordinate from the bell tower, ringing different combinations to direct his defenders' movements. But as he watched the battle unfold below, he realized that something unexpected was happening. His neighbors weren't just following his tactical plan, they were improving on it, adapting to circumstances with the kind of initiative and courage that couldn't be taught. Rebecca Garrett had turned her schoolhouse into a medical station, treating wounded defenders while simultaneously maintaining covering fire through the windows. Sheriff Garrett was moving between positions like a veteran sergeant, encouraging the newer fighters and coordinating ammunition distribution. Even Jim Hutchins had abandoned his assigned position to help defend the Murphy boarding house when he saw it was being overwhelmed. This wasn't just military tactics anymore. This was a community fighting for its survival with every skill and strength it possessed. Carver himself appeared in the street below the church, his cavalry saber gleaming in his hand as he looked up at the bell tower. "Tabor!" he shouted. "I know you're up there, the ghost of Glorietta Pass. Come down and face me like a man." Clay could have shot him easily from his elevated position, but something in Carver's challenge resonated with him. This wasn't just about tactics anymore, it was about the kind of man he chose to be, the kind of leader his community deserved. He slung his rifle across his shoulder and began climbing down from the bell tower. "Clay, no!" Sarah's voice called from across the street. "It's a trap!" But Clay had seen something in Carver's eyes that Sarah hadn't: desperation. The gang leader's strategy was failing, his men were falling, and his reputation as an unstoppable force was crumbling around him. This challenge wasn't tactical, it was personal. Clay stepped out of the church and walked slowly down the main street, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. Around him, the sounds of battle faded as both sides paused to watch the confrontation between their leaders. "You cost me 20 good men," Carver said, his wounded shoulder obviously paining him. "You cost yourself 20 good men when you chose to prey on innocent people," Clay replied calmly. Carver's hand moved toward his pistol. "Let's see if the ghost of Glorietta Pass is as fast as they say." But before either man could draw, the most unexpected thing happened. A piece of bread, hard, stale, carefully preserved, landed in the dust between them. Sarah Murphy stepped out from behind a nearby building, holding the remainder of the loaf that Clay had given her weeks ago. "This is what started it all," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every person in the street. "One act of kindness. One choice to help a stranger. That's what you're really fighting against. Carver, the idea that people can choose to care for each other instead of just taking what they want." Carver looked at the bread, then at the faces of the townspeople emerging from their defensive positions. For the first time, Clay saw uncertainty in the gang leader's eyes. "Your choice, Jack," Clay said quietly. "You can try to draw on me and probably die in this street. Or you can take your remaining men and ride out of here, and we'll let you go in peace." The silence stretched between them like a held breath, broken only by the whisper of wind through the valley and the distant sound of water flowing over stones. Then Black Jack Carver did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He holstered his weapon and stepped back. 6 months later, Clay Tabor stood in the same spot where he'd first encountered 200 desperate souls seeking salvation. But the man who stood there now bore little resemblance to the isolated hermit who'd lived in Widow's Hollow. The lines around his eyes spoke of laughter shared rather than solitude endured, and his hands, though still steady, now carried the calluses of community building rather than mere survival. The valley itself had transformed beyond recognition. Where once there had been a dying town clinging to the edge of extinction, now stood a thriving community that had become the envy of settlements throughout the territory. The main street bustled with activity as people went about their daily business, not the frantic scrambling of those barely hanging on, but the purposeful movement of citizens who knew their place in something larger than themselves. The new community charter lay spread across the table in Murphy's boarding house, surrounded by the same faces that had gathered to hear Clay's first address to the town. But where those faces had once shown desperation and fear, now they radiated confidence and desperation, pride. The document itself was a work of art, hand-lettered by Rebecca Garrett in her finest script and signed by every adult resident of Mercy Falls. Article 7, Sarah Murphy read aloud, her finger tracing the elegant handwriting. The Community Defense Force shall be maintained under the leadership of Clayton Tabor, with training and preparedness exercises conducted monthly to ensure the protection of all citizens. Clay shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah, we've discussed this. I don't need a formal title. The town disagrees, Sheriff Garrett said with a grin. Captain Tabor has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. These people had learned the value of recognizing leadership when they found it, and they weren't about to let false modesty deprive them of acknowledging what Clay had done for their community. Marcus Chen looked up from the ledger where he'd been recording the month's production figures. Speaking of titles, I think we need to officially recognize Sarah as mayor. She's been doing the job for 3 months now. Might as well make it official. Sarah blushed, but Clay could see the pleased satisfaction in her eyes. She'd proven herself a natural leader, with the kind of practical wisdom that made difficult decisions look easy and the diplomatic skills to keep diverse personalities working toward common goals. What about the territorial government? Tom Bradley asked. Any word on their response to our charter application? Clay smiled. Marshal Crenshaw visited last week. Seems that our success story has caught the attention of folks in the capital. They're considering using Mercy Falls as a model for other struggling communities throughout the territory. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The same government officials who'd threatened them with eviction 6 months ago were now asking for advice on community development. Colonel Morrison wrote to me as well. Clay continued, the Apache situation has stabilized, and he wanted to express his appreciation for our innovative approach to regional security. Apparently, the Carver Gang's defeat has discouraged other criminal organizations from operating in this area. Little Emma Murphy, now a healthy 8-year-old with bright eyes and an infectious laugh, tugged on Clay's sleeve. Uncle Clay, tell us about the celebration plans again. Clay lifted her onto his lap, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. 6 months ago, he'd barely been able to tolerate human contact. Now he found himself surrounded by an extended family that included everyone in Mercy Falls. Well, he said seriously, tomorrow marks exactly 6 months since your mama first knocked on my cabin door. The town council has decided that should be an official holiday community day when we celebrate what we've accomplished together. And there's going to be a feast? Emma asked. The biggest feast Mercy Falls has ever seen, Sarah confirmed, with food contributed by every family and enough for everyone to eat their fill. Clay looked around the room at the faces of people who'd become more than neighbors, they'd become his chosen family. The success of Mercy Falls wasn't measured just in economic prosperity or defensive preparedness, though both were impressive achievements. The real success was visible in the way people looked at each other, the way children played together without regard for which family had more or less, the way elderly folks were cared for by the entire community rather than left to struggle alone. There's one more thing, Clay said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box and set it on the table beside the charter. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were his military dog tags from the war. I've been thinking about the past a lot lately, he continued. About the choices that brought me to that cabin in Widow's Hollow and the choices that led me away from it. For a long time, I thought my military service was something to be ashamed of, something that disqualified me from being part of a peaceful community. He picked up the dog tags, feeling their familiar weight. But I realize now that everything I learned about leadership, about sacrifice, about the cost of protecting what matters, prepared me for this. For all of you. Clay stood up, still holding Emma, and walked to the window that looked out over the bustling main street of Mercy Falls. I want to formally donate these to the town museum that Rebecca's been planning. Not as a monument to war, but as a reminder that sometimes our darkest experiences prepare us for our greatest service. Sarah joined him at the window, her hand finding his free arm. What do you think your grandfather would say if he could see this place now? Clay thought about the trapping journal that still sat on his bedside table, filled with generations of mountain wisdom about survival and self-reliance. I think he'd say that the best way to honor the past is to build something worth passing on to the future. As the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Clay Tabor realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for in his years of isolation. Not peace through withdrawal from the world, but peace through engagement with it. Not strength through independence, but strength through interdependence. And it had all started with the simple decision to share his last loaf of bread with a stranger. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness really could change everything.